Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you for waiting a moment, and thank you for joining us for this latest edition of GEEOlogue. My name is James Backus. I'm speaking to you from Orlando, Florida, from the University of Central Florida, and from the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at our university, which we call GEO. We have for you today what I think will be a fascinating program with a fascinating speaker on a timely topic. The topic is the production and distribution of COVID vaccines at a time when the world still remains mired amid the COVID pandemic. Our speaker today, our guest, is Rachel Silverman. I first learned of Rachel when I read a very thoughtful article she wrote in the Outlook section of the Washington Post a few weeks ago. But Rachel is not new to discussions of global public health. She is a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, one of the finest think tanks, especially on issues of sustainable development that are quite important to me and to all engaged with GEO. And she leads the center's policy-oriented research on global health financing and incentive structures. I think that phrase incentive structures will be pertinent today. She's been there for the past decade. Before that, Rachel worked with the National Democratic Institute to support democratic governance in Kosovo. That's a topic for another day. She has a BA with distinction in international relations and economics from Stanford University, and she has a master's of philosophy with distinction in public health from University of Cambridge, where she was a Yates Cambridge scholar. Before introducing her and starting off by asking her a question or two, I just wanted to point out that we are recording this, and it will be uploaded onto YouTube later for those who want to watch later or rewatch. And that Rachel will be speaking for probably half an hour, then we'll spend the remaining half hour taking questions from all those who are watching and listening. You will be able to ask questions by raising your hand on our Zoom feature here in our new pandemic world. All that said, Rachel, yesterday, the United States of America announced that it was reversing the position of the previous administration under Donald Trump, and that now under President Joe Biden, the U.S. will be supporting in the World Trade Organization a waiver for COVID-19 vaccines from the WTO intellectual property rules. What about this? Do you think other countries that have been resisting this waiver will now follow the United States? New Zealand has already done so, but what about the European Union and others? The WTO is going to rule by this on consensus, or I think not at all. And then assuming that this waiver is approved, will it work? What will it accomplish? With those questions, I'm going to let Rachel tell us all about this issue. And Rachel, thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to having you in Orlando in the future, other than virtually. Please.
I would love to be in Orlando. And thank you, James, for the virtual invitation to speak. I guess to start off on the 2 points you raised, I mean, it's hard to prognosticate in this space. It does seem, certainly it is obvious that the US announcement has lent a certain momentum to this. There are probably many countries like New Zealand that could have gone either way and took their signal from the US. I think it is very likely this will push us in the direction of some sort of deal at the WTO. But to get Europe on board, I think Merkel just signaled that she remains pretty opposed to the TRIPS waiver. It will probably be a pretty watered down version. I think more important than maybe what the content is that there will be negotiations that will probably take an extended time to hammer out. So, again, predicting the future is hard, but I would say, it will probably be 6 months, something like that, before we have any sort of firm or movement that matters in practical sense. The question of will it work is an interesting one. I think we'll get into this as the presentation goes on. It is my view that in terms of the immediate to midterm challenge, a patent waiver is a pretty marginal issue, which is not to say that patents are never important or that IP restrictions are never important, but the kind of IP, the kind of knowledge you need to have to produce these vaccines and the time horizon for investments in new manufacturing capacity are suggestive to me that a temporary waiver, in particular, the temporary part, is not going to make much of a difference. But I do think there are some interesting things you could do to deal with some of the IP challenges, especially in the medium to long term. And especially if we think that, mRNA is the future, we need enough global manufacturing capacity of this for everyone, and that's worth significant public investment. So we can talk about that towards the end. Maybe you can get started with the presentation. Okay, so just a quick introduction. So today we're going to talk about intellectual property and COVID-19 vaccines. As full disclosure, I made, a couple disclosures. I produced most of this presentation before yesterday's announcement. So it tends to be at a higher level than maybe the minutia of the TRIPS rules, for example, but we can get into all of those more in the discussion to the extent it interests people. I think
we don't want to lose too many viewers.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you're right. So I'm sort of starting from the basics of what this debate is about, but then we can dig into the details as interest people. The other thing to say, I'm Rachel Silverman. I'm a policy fellow at CGD. I think very important to state up front, we are an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And I want to stress the independence point here. I do not take any money from the pharmaceutical industry. Our institution does not. We work on these issues. We try and be an independent voice. So, these are my honest perspectives, divorced from funding to the extent possible. We do receive foundation funding. All our funding sources are on the website, but I do not receive any pharmaceutical industry funding, either personally or through CGD. All right, so maybe let's get started. So what's the issue we're trying to solve? Well, the great news is that we have several highly effective vaccines that offer the scientific possibility to get us out of this awful global pandemic. But the bad news is that if we look at the global picture, what we're seeing is striking inequities in vaccine access. So Israel has jumped to the lead. They have more than 60% of their population has received a vaccine. The US and UK are not far behind. The European Union off to a slow start, but not now accelerating. But then down towards the bottom, South America and India, both of which are now in the throes of terrible COVID-19 waves, and Africa, which has thus far been spared some of the worst of COVID, but has extremely low vaccination levels and remains very vulnerable. Next slide, please. And as vaccination, so this is a graph produced by my colleagues Justin Sandifer and Arvind Subramanian. And it basically shows how the trajectory of expected vaccination in advanced economies versus a developing world. And the gap between them is what some activists have termed global vaccine apartheid. It's a difference in vaccination rates between advanced economies and the developing world. It is projected to be the worst around the end of 2021. Eventually, this will narrow. and close as we get towards 2022, 2023, but it will take a while. And in the interim, people are going to get sick and die, and in very unequal ways. And, in the United States, we're currently talking about authorizing Pfizer for use in young teenagers, people aged 12 to 15. Meanwhile, there are places where the elderly are still not vaccinated, where health workers are still going to work at risk every day. So these inequities are very severe and serious and need to be addressed. Next slide, please. And then meanwhile, as things are, as in part because of sorry, I'm just trying to not get distracted by the chat. It's also as the vaccines are expanding in high income countries, we're seeing the pandemic move towards the global south. So if you look historically in the first and second waves, the first wave, starting in March, or this doesn't go back that far, but the early waves really were concentrated in the global north in wealthy countries, in the United States and the European Union, which had terrible, terrible pandemics and a huge portion of the global deaths. But as we move past February of this year and we start to see vaccination ramping up in the EU and North America, we start to see the overall burden moving south to South America and Asia in particular. And this is driven in large part by what's happening in Brazil and India, which has really just been awful to watch. But it's not just limited to those countries. Nepal is spiking currently. We've seen terrible outbreaks in Uruguay and Paraguay and Peru. So we're really seeing this epidemic move to the south. It's changing the shape of where the burden is. Next slide, please. So why do we care about this? Well, I think the obvious and most overwhelming reason is the moral imperative. We have these effective vaccines. We want to save human life. Human life is valuable. There is an ongoing mass casualty event happening around the entire world. It will be pretty morally terrible if we all go on our nice summer vacations and ignore the fact that this catastrophe is continuing to happen around the world. It's also self-interest. Ongoing circulation lends itself to new variants, as we're seeing many times again. Those new variants might eventually lead to immune escape, reimportation, and of course, global instability caused by the ongoing pandemic. And then there's a diplomatic imperative. A lot has been said about, vaccine diplomacy, but it's just a very obvious and simple fact. If there's something we could do that we're not doing and we allow this inequity to continue, there will of course be justified global resentment of the West, who have all the vaccines, the poor countries have none. And if China and Russia are offering vaccine donations or even sales, that's going to be very attractive. And they will feel like those countries were there when we, as the West, were not. So for many reasons, we have to care about vaccine equity. But again, I think the moral imperative one by itself is a good reason to care about this. Next slide, please. So what's the problem? What's causing this vaccine inequity? Well, there are several problems happening all at the same time. Problem one is that Western countries have bought their way to the front of the line for the scarce vaccine availability. And I think one important thing to say here is that the way they've bought their way to the front of the line is not by paying more per dose. They're actually paying about the same or even sometimes less per dose than poorer countries. The way they bought their way to the front of the line is through advanced purchase agreements. Basically, they entered into large advanced purchase agreements before they even knew which vaccines would work. And they were able to do that because they are wealthy, because they could afford to enter into giant contracts with 7 different manufacturers on the hope that at least one of them would work out. And now that they have all these doses, they're using them on low priority populations, including teenagers. And that's happening before high priority populations in low and middle income countries. So vaccine supply is scaling up, but rich countries are first in line and they are using them for more than their high priority populations. I was luckily, vaccinated. I received my second dose. I'm very grateful for that. But I also recognize that I should not necessarily be the global priority population. Problem two is which vaccines are being produced. So if you look at the projections of overall numbers, they look not that bad, maybe like 10 to 12 billion doses being produced by the end of the year. Although take that with a grain of salt. Sometimes, you know, pharma companies can be a little bit overly optimistic about what they're actually going to get. But the problem is that this global production is relatively tilted towards the Chinese vaccines, the Russian vaccines, and then AstraZeneca and J&J. I would put the first two in a different category than the latter two. The first two, there are serious efficacy issues. There have been some safety issues. Brazil just denied use of, the Brazilian regulator just denied authorization for the Sputnik vaccine because it had improperly inactivated the live virus components, which is a really bad mistake. And then AstraZeneca and J&J, I would say these are broadly speaking safe and effective vaccines, but AstraZeneca in particular seems to be less effective than the mRNA vaccines, especially against the emerging variants. And J&J less so, but still to some extent. And of course, these have both had these concerns about blood clots and safety issues. Now, I think in both cases, the benefit of using them outweighs the risk. But if you're the rich countries and you have other options, maybe you can afford to be super cautious. Poor countries cannot. But we're getting this basically two-tier vaccination system where rich countries get what are perceived as the best vaccines, which are the mRNA vaccines. And then the poor countries are getting everything else, which is suboptimal. Problem 3 is that the efforts to scale vaccination are running into various material constraints. The existence of qualified personnel, specialized equipment, useful manufacturing sites, and basic raw materials like single-use bags. There's just a lot of demand all at once. There are constraints at various points in the supply chains. None of these are unsurmountable, but at the moment they are problematic in terms of the immediate supply availability. They've been to some extent exacerbated by trade restrictions, export restrictions, including from the US through the DPA. The exact mechanism is a bit complicated, but the gist of the problem is that the US was not exporting these things for quite a while. Next slide, please. Problem 4 is demand side. Basically, I was saying that rich countries put up enormous sums of money up front to reserve their vaccines, but this has not necessarily been forthcoming everywhere. And poor countries and the COVAX mechanism are not necessarily putting up enough money in advance to create commercial certainty that market will be there. Some big countries like India have not actually procured on behalf of their entire population, only for a very small portion. There's not nearly enough money in the system to purchase through COVAX to get to herd immunity. And then in some countries, there's been some feet dragging on regulatory approval of some of the better vaccines, including Pfizer in India. Pfizer submitted their application months ago, and they have not yet received an emergency use authorization. Now we get to problem 5, which is limited sharing and dissemination of the know-how and licenses to produce the vaccine. So this is the legal right to produce the vaccine, which is the patents and licenses. It says you can produce this and we will not sue you. And then there's the actual ability to produce the vaccine, the know-how and recipe that would allow you to actually produce it. And I want to distinguish the second one from kind of capacity in an abstract sense. I think there is sometimes a kind of somewhat offensive and borderline racist feeling that, oh, poor countries can't do this, poor countries can't produce good vaccines. I don't think that is true at all. It is not to say there is not the capacity in the sense that it could not be done. It is to say that you need the recipe to produce this specific vaccine. And that would be as much a constraint on a US manufacturing firm as a South African or Indian manufacturing firm. It's not to say there is anything intrinsically worse about any other firm. It is just to say that there is certain proprietary knowledge you need to have, and you can really only get it from the innovator. Next slide, please. And here we get to the crux of the issue. Oh, no, sorry, go back one. Which is that this whole TRIPS waiver and intellectual property debate is focused on this one relatively narrow part of the broader problem. Not to say it's irrelevant, not to say that it doesn't matter, but I think if you put it in the context of all the other constraints and issues we're facing, you sort of understand the uphill battle we're climbing. It's not the one thing that matters. It's not irrelevant, but it's not the one thing that matters. Next slide, please. So are patents the problem? So what is a patent? I mean, going back to basis, it's basically a time-limited legal monopoly on an innovation invention. It prevents the entry of competitors, at least competitors that are making the exact same product. You could still make a product that serves the same function, but it could not be the exact same product. It allows the inventor, in turn, to charge above marginal cost and recoup the investment in R&D, and it's intended to incentivize innovation. There are a lot of criticisms of the patent model, but we can get to some of them later, but this is the basic core idea. Internationally, patent monopolies are protected under the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement, known as TRIPS. The TRIPS agreement requires all countries to respect minimum IP standards, including drug patents and trade secrets. Importantly, the TRIPS agreement does include what are called flexibilities, specifically for public health purposes. And this includes the ability to issue a compulsory license under certain circumstances, which would allow the country to either produce itself or import/export, depending on the country, basically generic versions of a patented innovation for use in for public health purposes without permission of the patent holder. But there are some constraints on their ability to do that. In addition to TRIPS, there are often legal IP obligations that are contained within bilateral trade deals as well. For example, the USMCA has a chapter on intellectual property protections. Next slide, please. And one thing to understand is that this current debate over whether patents are a problem for the COVID response is situated within a very fraught history of the role of patents in limiting access to medicines historically. So there has been a long-standing battle between industry and the global south and health advocates about patents and access to medicine. Patents by design, if you think about what they do, they grant a legal monopoly. They restrict generic competition and they keep prices high by design. That is what they are supposed to do. That is them serving their purpose. They keep prices higher than they would in a competitive market. And so if you think about what that means, all right, if you have it above marginal cost, there are some percentage of people who are not going to be able to buy at that cost that would be able to buy at marginal cost. So patents, again, kind of by design, will often lead to restricted access to innovative medicines. Most notably, this historically happened for the HIV pandemic, where prices were high. They did not want to have reimportation of cheaper drugs, and there was really seriously delayed access in low and middle income countries. There are ways around this, even while maintaining the patent system. There are donations, which are kind of a stopgap measure. They're not that useful. One solution I think has some utility is tiered pricing, where you set the prices for different populations at prices that are locally affordable for those populations. But that requires negotiation and prevention of parallel reimportation, et cetera. So there are issues there as well that we can get into. But because of these broad issues with patents and the way that by design they prevent some people from accessing medicines, advocacy groups broadly do not like this system. They don't like patent exclusivity, and they would prefer a model of either publicly financed research and development, where then innovation is in the public domain, or delinkage type models, where okay, you can still have the private sector participating, but that basically once they come up with a model, an innovation, they don't make their money from the monopoly. They make the money from either a patent buyout, a prize. They make their money out from some sort of, annual remuneration, not from restricting access to the drug. So delinkage means a delinkage between revenue or profit and the volume of the drugs sold. So they want a system that would create incentives for maximum access versus a more constrained access at higher prices, which is, again, what a kind of monopoly is designed to do. Next slide, please. So as soon as the pandemic started, civil society groups mobilized around this issue. There is a people's vaccine campaign backed by a lot of the usual suspects, Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others. No patents or profiteering during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. And as we talked about at the top, this is a very live issue. Should there be patents in a pandemic? Discussions are ongoing at the WTO as we speak, and the US yesterday announced its support for the TRIPS waiver. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of go over quickly what the arguments are for both sides. I want to be very clear that I'm a little bit caricaturing for the sake of clarity. I don't think I'm being unfair in the way I'm describing the arguments, but I'm putting them in my own words, let's say. I don't think this is exactly the words they would use. So advocates say no patents in a pandemic. It's unacceptable and immoral and ghoulish to allow profiteering when people's lives are at stake. We need a people's vaccine. We need something that is nonprofit, unpatented. We want the know-how widely shared to enable the quickest possible vaccine uptake and public money supported vaccine development. So why should private companies get to profit, or at least profit in excess amounts? Maybe they can get some compensation, but this is a publicly supported innovation. Why are we socializing the risk and privatizing the return? Yes, some originators have licensed to generic companies, and that's good, but it's still done on a for-profit, proprietary, non-transparent, one-off manner. It takes time and effort to negotiate each of these licenses. And most importantly, this leaves some potential capacity on the table. Maybe there are some manufacturers out there who could do this, and they're not being reached out. Industry should share their know-how and patents openly through CTAC, which is a WHO mechanism to enable wide scale-up. And we should temporarily, as a result of these arguments, one solution, it's not as radical as get rid of patents forever, but we should support a temporary waiver on international patent protections for COVID-related IP, which will allow others to produce vaccines. The activists also, and advocates also, and the waiver itself also suggests all COVID-related technologies, not just vaccines, also diagnostics and therapeutics, although the US has so far only said they support this vis-a-vis vaccines. Next slide, please. Industry says, we're already doing all we can. Patents in the modern IP system were what allowed out development of these innovations in the first place. And trashing patents would make it hard for us to cooperate in the next pandemic. What's the incentive to do so? And we're already licensing widely. It's not like there's unused manufacturing capacity out there in the world, or we're hoarding it all for ourselves. We are sharing. We're just sharing through these bilateral deals, but we are scaling production dramatically. We need to be directly involved in any licensing to ensure quality control and oversight and prevent substandard products from entering the market. And look, I mean, you can criticize the pharma industry, but you can say, I've seen some reporting saying they're making these crazy profits, but they're really not that crazy. Some of us, like AstraZeneca, are more or less selling at cost. And even the for-profit producers, the ones that are, openly for-profit, like AstraZeneca, are only getting about maybe 25% margins. So it's not like they're selling these for $1,000 a dose. Even the most expensive ones are more on the order of $20 a dose, which is, in the scheme of things, reasonably priced. And this is the one I think is a little bit absurd. And you wouldn't want China and Russia getting our trade secrets, would you? Which we'll come back to. I don't think that's a very compelling argument. Next slide, please. Again, caricaturing what these two sides tend to think of each other. Again, I'm being a little bit over the top, but it's very dug in, it's very polarized, and there's a lot of talking past each other. I think pharma and industry and IP advocates see some of the activist campaigners as naive and impractical. They don't understand incentives. They want things for free. Everything has a cost. And, I think the activists and some low and middle income countries see pharma as ghoulish, that they're greedy, they're patent hoarding. they're profiteering from a pandemic. And I think, you know, when there's this much distrust, it's kind of hard to have a conversation sometimes around the practicalities. Yeah. And next slide, please. And I think it's further complicated by the fact that this is my view. Now I'm going to my view. Okay. Previously, I was trying to characterize other views. Now I'm going to my view. Is that, in my view, both sides are simultaneously right and wrong to some degree. And look, there are nuances in all of this. I'm not saying every advocate says all of this. I'm not saying every pharma company says the opposite. But advocates are absolutely right in some of the things they're saying. Pharma companies are greedy. Their entire reason for being is to make money. That's what they do. They are responsive to their shareholders. And they are also right that it is a moral imperative to vaccinate the world, and that has to be a higher priority than private profit. They are correct that with time, resources, IP, and know-how, poor countries can absolutely build capacity to manufacture these vaccines. It's just not true that it's not possible, it can't be done. It takes time, it's not going to happen overnight, it takes financing, it takes support, but it's been done before and it can be done again. It is also true that patents historically and in our current paradigm are often barriers to access to medicines, and we need to find some structural fixes. For many of these things, I think delinkage approaches could be helpful. I'm also a fan of value-based tiered pricing. But we need some better solutions structurally to make sure that innovations can reach poor countries and poor people at affordable prices. And pharma companies did take public money, a lot of it. The public de-risked the investment. They paid for some of the foundational research. The public has a stake in wide access and negotiating leverage. Here's where I think advocates are wrong. The pharma companies oppose sharing and open licensing. I don't think that's because they are afraid of losing their stake in the COVID vaccine market. I think it is because of the precedent and the loss of control of their trade secrets. A lot of the mRNA platforms in particular, for example, are also probably going to be useful for a whole new generation of other vaccines for cancer applications. There are tons of things already in trials, and they want to hold on to that. I think it's much more about that than it is about the actual market for COVID-19 vaccines. This is the second one is probably the biggest place I differ from the advocates. I think incentives really matter, and greed is basically, it can be good. It can be bad if the greed is at expense of people's lives, but it can be good if it's channeled towards social good. My background's in economics, and I really believe incentives matter. Pharma has delivered effective vaccines, and I think that really needs to be met with a reward, not a penalty. I think pharma is, you know, as usual, overstating how these things go and saying, oh, we won't do anything next time. I think that's not true, but I think at the margins it matters. You want pharma, you want everyone to believe that if you tackle the most important problems in society, you will be rewarded for it, not penalized, not yelled at, basically. You want to be treated as heroes, not villains. And if you're going to be treated as villains for tackling the most important problems, why not tackle something less important, but more likely to make you a lot of money, make the next Botox, for example. IP waivers, okay, and the third point, and I think actually most of the advocates sort of agree with this to some extent. IP waivers by themselves, in my view, are not that helpful because the vaccines cannot easily be reverse engineered. And my concern here is that the waiver will make it less likely that pharma will proactively share its know-how. If basically we're announcing we're no longer respecting your IP, I'm a hard-nosed, greedy pharma company. Am I going to go out sharing my IP, sharing my knowledge for other people to then take it? I think if I'm a greedy pharma company, I'm going to hold it close to my chest. Next slide, please. And then for industry, industry is right that vaccines are hard to make, that patents specifically are not the primary barrier to entry, at least for now. They might be later. I'm not, again, not claiming patents never pose a problem, they do. And I do think there is some important role for the originator in overseeing quality control and safety of the production process. I think there is a real risk that, for example, again, it's not to say no one could make it safely or it can't be made safely in low and middle income countries, but if you have a totally open process, everyone's making something and calling it a Pfizer vaccine without any oversight, I do think there is some risk that some of that would be substandard and could potentially feed into broader vaccine hesitancy. But industry is also wrong. It is laughable to argue that giving up trade secrets would save too many lives in China and Russia. It is not morally tenable to hold on to knowledge that could be used to save lives. And industry does not have sufficient urgency to vaccinate the world, and by itself does not have the right incentives to do so, inviting government and public intervention. Next slide, please. All right, so what's the way forward given all of this? So, as I said at the top, I tend to think the IP waiver is fairly marginal. I think probably the loudest yelling about it being either amazing or terrible is overstated. I think it will end up being pretty limited in scope and effect. So with or without the IP waiver, ending the pandemic has to be our #1 global priority. And, this is not the time to either pinch pennies if you're a government or to, try and extract every cent if you are a pharmaceutical company. It's also not the time to fight battles on principle. I think we need to be ruthlessly practical about what is the fastest possible way to get what we need. So I think this is a three-pronged agenda. The first would be rapid donation and reallocation of rich countries' surpluses. We need to get those to poorer countries as quickly as humanly possible. We should not be vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds before sending vaccines abroad to cover at least the highest priority population. We need really big public subsidy to scale manufacturing, particularly for the flexible mRNA platform. I think we are thinking way too small in terms of the public subsidy that is justified here. This is a relatively cheap insurance policy against new variants in the next pandemic, and we need to be thinking big. We need factories on every continent. We need enough capacity to produce 3 doses per person per year in perpetuity. And we do need easier the hard way negotiations with Pfizer and Moderna to license and transfer the needed tech to enable global scale up. Now, again, I maybe differ from some of the advocates in that I am very happy for this to be richly compensated. I would be very happy to see a $100 billion contract to Pfizer that says, you are now very rich, go build a factory on every continent and transfer all your tech, and we're buying out your IP. I think that is a perfectly good solution. It turns out with a lot of money, a lot of problems can be solved. And again, I'm very happy for the companies that have helped get us out of this crisis to be richly compensated for doing so, even if they got public money up front. I think that's fine, honestly. But we need to be thinking at a bigger scale. We do need the IP, but we also need the money. We need the cooperation of the originators, and we need to be ruthlessly practical about how we get out of this crisis. So that's all for now, and over to you all for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fascinating, as I had predicted. We have people participating from all over the world. Rachel, I forewarned you, some of those participating are among the finest international legal scholars on the planet. We want to give everyone a chance to ask questions. Alex, would you check your chat, because I asked you a question I need an answer to. The way to ask a question is to raise your hand on the screen, and then I think Alex is going to be able to tell us who has done so. I see a question from Mr. Gibbons. Unmute. Please unmute. Please unmute so we can hear you.
We cannot unmute ourselves. You have to do it.
Okay, did it. Well, I'm here primarily because of my great friend Jim Backus, and I
go ahead. Nice
okay.
to see you, my friend.
Yeah, I have a question actually for Jim and Rachel. And by the way, Rachel, that was a great presentation, and I deeply appreciate this. My question has to do with the precedent of this potential decision at the WTO, because I'm a one-off. I'm not doing vaccine work, but I have started a company called CancerX that is a securitized bond portfolio for developing intellectual property and protecting it through preclinical trials through phase 3. And what we are doing is selling that IP back to Big Pharma to do new cancer drugs. It's a portfolio of 30 to 40 highly diversified projects. And this is, I'm not the brainchild of this, but my partners at MIT are in their Institute for Financial Engineering. Now, my question is, we have just put this portfolio together for CancerX. And the rating agencies have scrubbed this intently. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, they have been involved with this from the very beginning. And our question has to do with how in the world am I going to hold on to these ratings if the WTO pulls the rug out from underneath us here on this IP? Can you, if you get the gist of the question, I mean, this would be devastating to this 6-year effort to create this company that is really unique. It's not greed or profit oriented like you say some of these pharmaceutical companies are, and they are, I've dealt with them. But the question is, Jim and Rachel, how do you think this is going to happen here at the WTO?
Yeah, I might give this one to James. I think he might be better placed to talk about it.
Well, thank you, Rachel, I think. I share these concerns, Cliff. So if you remember when you and I were young, it was the 1980s. And there was a nuclear freeze movement among the advocates at the time. And the likes of you and I were not in favor of a nuclear freeze. We were in favor of cutting nuclear weapons, of diminishing the size of the stock of those weapons, not just freezing them. But the nature of the discussion at the time was, well, if you're not in favor of a nuclear freeze, then you're in favor of nuclear war. I think we've got something of that same situation here involving the talk over the vaccine waiver. If you're not in favor of the waiver, then you must be in favor of letting stacks of bodies pile up in the public parks of India. And rational suggestions such as Rachel has made about what might really solve the problem are not fully taken into account because advocates can't see beyond this supposed one cure-all that they've anointed as the answer for the problem. So that's where we are in the WTO. Now, what do I think will happen in the WTO? First of all, as I have written, I would, if I were president or USTR, not have supported a waiver. I would be focusing on the real problem of production and distribution, in the ways Rachel has suggested. But here we are. I think it's important to point out that just because the United States is in favor of this does not mean that now the WTO is going to do it. There are still quite a few holdouts, including, I think, especially the European Union. It will be critical to see what position the Union takes. I think Merkel's statement yesterday is highly significant. Also, it's not going to happen immediately. Already they're talking about doing this in November at the next ministerial conference, if in fact the conference occurs. And within the WTO, that's viewed as rapid progress, but out in the rest of the world, that's the end of this year. There are a lot of people who are going to die all over the world between now and then. And then there's a question of what exactly this waiver would be. And if indeed they end up passing a waiver, I think it'll be much more narrow in scope. There'll be a specific time limit on it. And as Rachel said, the impact will be marginal, other than the pressure that's being brought to bear because of it on the industry. Now to your point, the precedent. On the one hand, it's a very bad signal if the world can't not come together to deal with this global crisis, because what does that say about our ability to deal with future pandemics or climate change or other kinds of issues? We have to come together, and I have suggested that we do so, and so has Rachel, in ways other than through a WTO waiver. But on the other hand, if we do pass this waiver, I worry, as you do, about the precedent. What about these future drugs for future pandemics? Looking beyond just medicine, what does this say about technology transfer, about trade secrets for technology transfer? As it is, developed countries are making the same mistakes they made in the HIV/AIDS drug crisis by giving not an inch. There is a mandate, a mandatory provision in the TRIPS agreement that says that developed countries must make technology transfer to the least developed countries in the world. They have not done so. But 25 years, that's been a mandatory obligation. It hasn't happened. They're not even reporting on progress. So this, I think, sends a bad signal as a precedent, not only in issues related to the trade dimensions of global health, but also climate change, mitigation and adaptation, other types of technologies to deal with the innovations we need to confront biodiversity, deforestation, and so much more. So I'm worried about this as a precedent. I think Rich Hill has the next question, and then Robert Yates, and then Lothar Ehring in Brussels. Rich, go ahead. And the rest of the questions, I think, will be for Rachel, our guest. Also, we're going to extend this for an extra 10 minutes or so to be able to facilitate questions. I'm hoping Rachel can stay. There's a great deal of interest in all she said. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for this. So I'm a rabid, foaming at the mouth advocate, but I really like what James said. I don't always agree with what James said, but often he's very poised and makes excellent compromise.
Thank you. Neither does my wife, Richard. But I can guarantee you my children don't.
And Rachel,
go ahead.
Rachel,
I don't expect all my friends to agree with me on everything.
Rachel, I really want to thank you for a super well-balanced presentation, which I could sit through without getting upset. And I think I think you very fairly presented the positions of the two sides and the strong points and the weak points of both sides. It's an excellent presentation. I have a quick comment and then an honest question for you, Rachel. The quick comment is, don't forget that a TRIPS waiver is not an abolition of patents worldwide. The WIPO patent treaties are still in force, and national law on patents are still in force. So, don't paint that devil bigger than it actually is. Yeah, we have to worry about precedents, but we're not saying wipe out patents. We're just saying stop the enforcement mechanism in WTO, which, as many of us know here, has actually been abused by certain countries, which I don't have to name. Hopefully the new administration will stop doing that. So let's not exaggerate that. Now, the honest question for you, Rachel, now I'm sitting here in Switzerland. What peeves me off most about the pharmas is that, as you know, Switzerland is one of the many countries that pre-ordered and gave a lot of money, saying, look, we're going to buy all this stuff and you're going to build factories on speculation and we're going to buy on speculation. And then if it doesn't work, okay, fine, we've lost our money. But meanwhile, we got the doses. Well, guess what? They didn't build the factories. They didn't pre-produce. So when the vaccine was effective, we can't get it. we still have slowdowns. I mean, just here in Geneva, the biggest vaccination center had to close for 2 days because they weren't delivering the vaccines. So am I correct that this is scandalous and this is really excessive greed, or is this an incorrect understanding of the facts? That's an honest question.
I mean, I don't know that it's greed per se. I mean, it could, I mean, I agree. Well, I mean, it's certainly very frustrating. So I agree with you on that point. It's not necessarily clear to me what's happening. I guess my read on what's happening is that genuinely the large producers are trying, at least for now, to scale as quickly as they can, because they know that at least in the short to medium term, they will sell everything they can produce. I think it genuinely is hard. I think they probably bit off more than they could chew with pre-orders. And I think it's good that the pre-orders were there, but they probably should have been, you know, they weren't transparent. There wasn't clarity about what the prioritization was between countries. Obviously, there have also been like export controls, which makes things complicated. I know Canada's very upset because they also famously pre-ordered more than everyone in the world. And they are nonetheless, they don't have local manufacturing capacity. So they are dependent on exports from elsewhere and they have not gotten their vaccines. You know, I think it's not greed exactly, because I think they really are trying to do it, but it's disorganization, it's overpromising, it's lack of enough capacity that's ready-made to start pumping these out. So, and lack of transparency, which is that we don't know what's in these contracts, we don't know what the milestones are, we don't know what the delivery dates are, and therefore we don't know if the obligations are being met or not. So I think calling it greed is like a little bit too narrow, but I agree there's a lot going on that is problematic. But again, I guess one thing I'm really thinking about now is like, what's the long-term vision? And I just think that having much more vaccination capacity than the market would provide for is going to be a global public good, because we need that lay capacity that exists to ramp up quickly everywhere for the next pandemic, for the next variant, whatever it is. So this is making me think like we need to be thinking in subsidy terms that are much, much bigger than what we've been thinking thus far. There's the private incentive to do this to some extent, but it's not going to match, how quickly and in what numbers we need vaccines everywhere. So I think we're going to have to subsidize the lay capacity. And I think that's probably a very good global investment.
Okay, thanks so much, Rich, for that question. Next we're going to have Robert Yates, then Lothar Ehring, and after that, Tom, then Damien. Please go ahead, Robert.
Thank you very much, Steve. And to those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Universal Health at Chatham House in London. Thanks very much for the presentation, Rachel. And I think you're right that sort of historically, the debate has been very polarized, and you showed those sort of extreme views there. But I just wonder if that's really the case now. And that if you look particularly at the People's Vaccine Alliance, which I think you were rather dismissive of, sort of calling them the usual suspects of Oxfam and a bunch of CSOs, because this is actually headed up in effect by the head of UNAIDS, Winnie Binyamina. And it's supported by many organizations now, including the likes of the elders, who are sort of former heads of state, and also many others have signed on recently to the principles of the People's Vaccine Alliance, likes of Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister. And you can see that there is a growing group of very eminent people. Helen Clark's another one, the chair of the IPPR, very much supporting the ideals of the People's Vaccine Alliance now. So I think there is more of a consensus now, sort of building around this being a good idea, and ideas that might have sounded radical, just a few months ago, are now becoming mainstream. 175 Nobel laureates and former heads of state wrote the letter to President Biden to recommend the TRIPS waiver. But I think now my question, I suppose, really is that looking at where we are now, and which isn't particularly pretty, obviously the dreadful inequality in distribution of vaccines, and I think the extremely tardy willingness to have tax transfers to developing countries that we've sort of seen in recent months. Do you think things could have been different had CTAP been given more political commitments and public financing early on? This was an idea from the government of Costa Rica, you know, to create a sort of a patent pool in effect, and very much facilitate the sharing of technology and expertise. So obviously going beyond the IP, if we were to start this again with much greater commitment to CTAP, do you think that could have potentially been a good mechanism, and maybe still, you know, that will be the best way forward?
So, all right. So to answer maybe the first part of your question first, you know, could we have done something different going back in time? I think from where we sit now, the one thing, you know, I would caution on that is it's really hard to put ourselves back in the mindset of what it was like even 6 or 8 months ago. I guess the Pfizer trial results were in November, so say 7 months ago. We didn't know if there would be a successful vaccine. We certainly didn't know which ones would be successful, or that there would be multiple successful ones. And, you know, again, what we saw in the US and in Europe to a lesser extent, but in the UK, was a willingness to throw a lot of money at it at risk on behalf of their own populations. But poorer countries didn't have that luxury, even if they had the IP, even if they had the open knowledge. I mean, I remember the press coverage at the time of Serum Institute manufacturing AstraZeneca at risk. And, you know, it was like the gamble, the India's biggest gamble or something like that, right? That they were putting, even though they had the license, they were putting up their own money to manufacture at risk, and they had no idea if it would work. You know, they hoped, but and they had some things to go on. So I think a lot of times it gets bogged down in the IP, the idea that, oh, if only everyone had the IP, they'd all be producing, they'd all be investing. I think, you know, it's still expensive to do at risk. And if you don't have governments who are either willing or able to afford doing that, I'm not sure it would look that different. I think part of what's happening with the licensing now, part of it's pressure for sure, but part of it is just that, okay, well, now we know these products work. And so there will probably be a market for them if we do, you know, scale beyond where we already have pre-orders for. So we had pre-orders that de-risked maybe our first tranche of investments, our first manufacturing lines. But now that we know they work, okay, well, now it makes sense to expand more. I think that all could have happened earlier with more money. I really do think that the big mistake of this pandemic was less about the IP and more about the penny pinching. Like, this was the world's biggest problem, and we were talking in the millions or hundreds of millions, while the damage was in the tens of billions a day. You know, I think if we could go back in time, my biggest advice would just be throw money at everything. Throw it, just like throw it. You cannot overspend on this. You know, okay, so that's my first point. That's what I think we really could have and should have done differently with the benefit of hindsight. On the CTAP point, you know, it's tough because I do understand the industry objection to it to some extent. I mean, advocates want the open science, open sharing approach. And pharma doesn't want that because their trade secrets are valuable. It's their business. And they're willing to license to some extent, but within these bilateral deals that protect the IP end. And I kind of get that. I mean, if you do immediately post all your IP to a public forum, what's the commercial incentive? So to me, I guess CTAP, you know, it's one model. I think it could work potentially, but it would have to be as part of a broader shift towards just a very different way of funding R&D. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, although I do think incentives matter and we should keep incentives in the system to some extent. But I think it's the kind of thing that's very hard to just tack on top of a global system that's organized as it is and expect people to participate. So even if there was more political backing, I don't think there would be that much going through CTAP. Again, I'm not opposed to the idea per se. But I just think it's part of a bigger picture vision, which is not where we are right now. And if we want to move there, then we can have that discussion, and maybe we should have that discussion, but it's a bigger conversation than just everyone should post patents to CTAP.
Thank you, Rachel, and Robert, thank you. Please give my regards to all my other friends at Chatham. I hope to get back there sometime soon. Next on the list is from Brussels, Lothar Ehring, who I'm sure is speaking in his personal capacity. He's also with DG Trade at the European Union, and long ago worked with me in Geneva. Lothar?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Ms. Silverman, for your outstanding presentation. I read many pieces and saw many events on the matter. I surely missed one or the other, but it is the first time that I see something that is of this quality.
Oh, thank you.
I have first an IP question and then a question taking outside of the IP realm, because you touched upon it yourself. Mr. Hill, I think, who just asked the penultimate question, referred to it, but then did not dig deeper. The point of other international intellectual property protection obligations that exist or may exist under other multilateral conventions and under other trade agreements, which are not automatically lifted by virtue of a WTO waiver. I imagine that sometimes this is the case. It's also a question of the legal technique used. Sometimes these are incorporations by reference, but I'm sure there is one or the other international legal regime which is not automatically lifted if WTO TRIPS obligations are temporarily through the waiver. And my question to you is whether you have a legal theory for those barriers to automatically give way as well, because dealing with all of them manually would be a lot of additional procedural work with little gain. Of course, there's the option of simply ignoring those legal obligations, and what unfortunately is a tendency in many places to consider WTO rules the only ones that really matter, and ignore many of the others. And I ask the question because there are similar situations and have been in the past. For example, when TRIPS suspension was permitted as a result of a successful dispute in the WTO, the controversy already came up, but good legal theories are available for saying why and how the parallel obligation can be suspended as well. But for this case, I don't have one, and that's why my question is to you whether you have a legal theory for that. And my second question is about what you said about the moral dimension, and very rightly you said that it is unethical to vaccinate 16-year-olds at home if somewhere abroad 65-year-olds are not, or 75-year-olds are not yet all vaccinated. That is unethical because of the utilitarian ethical framework that you should save as many lives as possible. And in this situation, you would save one domestic life at the price of sacrificing 100 or more lives abroad. And so on that basis, you could almost come up with a perfect formula on where the vaccines should go when, and that is an important question, not just this time, because as you said, certain things could have been done better, but will they really be done better next time? And will it not inherently always be the case that at the beginning you don't have enough vaccines immediately for everybody? So there is a phase where the producing governments and therefore countries, and therefore potentially exporting countries, are making decisions about distributing lives and deaths. You have said it yourself. So this is super serious and should be taken seriously. And in theory, you could come up with a perfect formula of who should have access in which order. However, how do you relate that to human rights, which are also obligations on governments towards the people under their jurisdiction, first and foremost? That's also why the WTO agreement allows export restrictions and allows a preference to saving lives domestically, even if that comes at the cost of sacrificing lives abroad. But human rights and certainly ethics, national human rights obligations and international human rights obligations may tell us something slightly different, and I'd be interested to hear on that from you. Thank you.
Okay, so on the first part of your question, I'm not a lawyer. I do not have a legal theory, so I have to pass on that one. On the second part of your question,
let me interject. Even if you were a lawyer, you've just gotten a taste of what it's like to sit on the appellate body of the WTO.
Okay, yes,
and have one of these brilliant young lawyers who works for you ask you the very hardest questions.
I'm gonna have to pass on that one. I could not tell you.
Making it worse is that Lothar's grown up and he's even smarter than he used to be. Yeah, go on, I'm sorry.
On ethical allocation of vaccine, I mean, this is a really tough, well, okay, a couple of things. In the next pandemic, it's going to probably look totally different. It might be a completely different population at risk. It will take some time to understand who the population at risk are. So it's not like you can make, even if you had all that information from this pandemic, it's not like you could make some agreement about what that population would look like the next time around. It's just could be a completely different disease that affects people in different ways. It's not going to be the same risk categories necessarily. For this pandemic, I mean, well, okay, sorry. And to say also for the next pandemic, I mean, I think one thing we've seen in this pandemic is just that whatever you think about the ethics and idealist version of any of this, it's not politically tenable to export vaccines in large numbers before vaccinating, while people at home can't get vaccines. And, you know, that's just the political reality of the situation, regardless of what the ethics of it are. And you can push on that to some extent, and you can probably make an impact at the margins. Maybe we can convince Biden to send vaccines abroad versus to 12 to 15-year-olds, but big picture, they're not going to change that. So what can you do about that? Well, one thing you can do is not, and this is kind of antithetical to free trade principles, but you can say, well, this is why it's a big risk to have manufacturing capacity concentrated in just a handful of countries. We need a disaggregated network of facilities, right? Such that we're not just reliant on a couple of big countries who are going to want to vaccinate their entire populations first. We're going to have some people who are able to export more quickly. You know, I think that's probably the only practical way forward. And then you can use kind of activist and moral pressure around the margins. But I think we have to be, again, you know, ruthlessly pragmatic and realistic about what the political pressures are that are going to be brought to bear.
Thank you. We're all still here. We have two more questions. What I propose to do is take those questions, give Rachel a chance to answer, and then we'll close it up for now. I'm going to recognize Tom, who's been waiting, and then Damien will ask the last question. Tom, go ahead.
Okay, so quickly, I'm not a legal expert, just a retired economist from North Carolina State University. Thank you, Rachel, for the excellent presentation, but this is a time to quibble. You worried about monopoly and prices above marginal costs that poor people cannot afford. In the United States, any of us who've been vaccinated know that we paid a price of zero. So government subsidies can handle that problem. Okay, my more serious.
All right, but it depends if the government can afford it. Right, so yes, government subsidies can, if the government can afford it. If it's priced above.
International aid is relevant also. Which government? Okay, yeah. More important concern is, I think you've underestimated the role of small pharma. You talk about big companies, small pharma. The company that invented the virus, the vaccination, is very small. It's called the Pfizer one. It was not invented by Pfizer, as most of you probably know. It's BioNTech and Mainz, German. based firm started by immigrants. So I think for future problems, especially the possibility of new ideas coming from small startups is very important and not to be ignored.
I agree with you on that. You know, and just very briefly, because I know we have to wrap up. I mean, I agree with you on that broadly, and that is why I think that incentives matter, even if there's public funding, you know, in the immediate term, and maybe for the formative research. You still have a kind of pipeline of biotech, of startups, and if you want them focused on the right kinds of problems for maximum social good, the incentives need to be aligned. So I agree with you.
Especially when you don't know what the next problem is going to be, and you don't know who the next startup is going to be either.
Thank you so much, Tom. Very helpful and thoughtful. Damien, you have the last question for Rachel.
Well, thank you very much. So Damien Brucker from the International Chamber of Commerce, and thanks for such a brilliant presentation. My question is about the WTO politics here, because the Director General has been talking for some time about a third way, which I think goes somewhere between the two camps that you were outlining. Now, with the United States engaging in the TRIPS discussions, sort of, do you have any sense of where the WTO itself, as the Secretariat, might want to go, and what sort of role, what greater role could the WTO itself play, sort of beyond the negotiations in the TRIPS Council? And sort of related to that, one proposal that the ICC has on the table is really for the WTO to have a much more robust monitoring role, especially over the vaccine supply chain, also to sort of stand up a clearinghouse of sorts to match latent manufacturing capacity in the developing world with producers in the developed world. So I was just wondering whether you thought there's a specific role outside of the negotiation function for the WTO that it can usefully play in a rather short time period.
You know, I don't honestly know. I'm not saying there isn't, but I'm not sure I've thought about this question enough to give you a good answer on it. I'm sorry.
I have, and there's a whole chapter about this in my next book, which will go in its final form to Cambridge next week. So we'll have to wait a few months for it. But the new Director General said when she came on board that she thought the first topic on the agenda for the WTO should be healthcare. Making certain everyone's vaccinated against COVID-19 is at the top of that list, but it's a much broader list. We need to eliminate all the tariffs on medicines and medical goods that have been hindrances to trade during the pandemic. We need to deal with the issue of export restrictions in a way we've never done before. We need to harmonize standards on these issues and develop more mutual recognition agreements to speed trade in medicines and medical goods. We focused on national production here, but the national producers point out that while they're producing something here, they're trading and importing and reassembling and relying on raw materials and inputs from everywhere. And the more we can eliminate barriers to all of those inputs, the more we can produce what the world needs and at a lower price. So in addition to dealing with this issue, I think the WTO should be negotiating a medical trade agreement. It could begin as a plurilateral agreement among some, but not all WTO members, but ideally it should be a multilateral agreement, and they should be doing this now. Some members have suggested this, but it's not been done. In terms of your other point, the ICC is as usual, playing a very positive role in world trade. I'm a bit biased since, as you may know, I spent a dozen years chairing the ICC's Trade and Investment Policy Commission. But the question here is the actual role of the WTO. The WTO is very much member driven and can't do anything unless all the members agree on it. Secretariat serves the members, but it has no independent authority separate and apart from the members to do anything, in contrast, in some respects, to the other Bretton Woods institutions. The Director General can play an important role, but her role largely is as an honest broker, someone who could be a mediator behind the scenes while pointing the way forward publicly. In her brief tenure so far, I think she's done an excellent job. But ultimately, this is to the members themselves. If we want the WTO to do more monitoring, then all the WTO members are going to have to agree on it. In my view, we should have a much more vigorous and extensive trade review process than we have now. More frequently, more extensive in what we review, but I'm not certain that the Secretariat should be given any independent authority to do anything. Rachel, any final words?
No, just would like to mobilize you all, hopefully, as collaborators and, charting a ambitious and practical path forward. I really do think this is the #1 global problem we have to solve, and as much resources, manpower we can get behind it, it's all for the good. So thank you.
And Rachel, we thank you very much, especially for staying on to answer some more questions. And on behalf of GEO and the University of Central Florida, I want to thank all of you all over the world for joining with us. We'll be having another GEOlogue sometime soon. Thank you so much and stay safe.
Thank you.